The last thing my grandfather said to me was about the canned peaches. Not goodbye, not I love you. Not some wisdom-laden farewell that I could tattoo on my memory and carry forward like a torch. He said, "The peaches are behind the water jugs, 3rd row, left side, don't forget." Then he seized. His hand locked around my wrist with a strength that shouldn't have belonged to a 78-year-old man whose body had been quietly consuming itself for months. His eyes went wide, not with pain, but with something worse, frustration, like a man watching a filing cabinet topple before he could label the last drawer. My name is Colton Embry. I was 17 when my grandfather, Aldous Embry, died in the upstairs hallway of his house on Marsh Creek Road, 6 feet from the attic hatch he'd spent the last decade filling. I was 17 when the outbreak started 3 weeks later. I'm 19 now. And I'm telling this because someone should know what love looks like when it wears the wrong costume for 20 years. Everyone thought Aldous was losing his mind. My mother, his daughter-in-law, called it compulsive hoarding, masked as preparedness. My father just stopped visiting. The neighbors on Marsh Creek knew him as the old man who got deliveries 4 times a week, cases of things that had no logical relationship to each other. Water purification tablets and wool blankets and surgical tape and powdered electrolytes and seed packets and wind-up flashlights and antibiotics that he must have gotten from veterinary supply catalogs because no doctor would prescribe that volume. The attic sagged. My Uncle Wren joked that the house would collapse before whatever apocalypse Aldous was bracing for. I was the only one who still visited, not because I believed him, because he paid me $40 to help carry boxes up the fold-down ladder every other Saturday, and because his grilled cheese sandwiches were better than anything in my mother's kitchen, and because, if I'm honest, he never asked me about school or girls or my future. He asked me about inventory. "Colton, how many gallons did we log last week?" "Colton, check the expiration rotation on shelf 9. "Colton, do you remember where the hand crank radio is?" I didn't understand it. I half listened. I pocketed the $40 and went home and didn't think about it until the next Saturday. When he died, I inherited the house. Not by design, my father wanted nothing to do with it, and the will was written before their estrangement hardened. I was 17 with a 3-bedroom house and an attic that I'd spent 2 years filling without ever once asking what it was for. 3 weeks after the funeral, the first reports came from a meatpacking plant in Ogden, 40 miles north. Workers attacking other workers, biting, not stopping when bones broke. The footage that leaked before the internet stuttered and dropped looked like a workplace brawl, until you noticed that the woman on the floor had no throat left and was still trying to stand. I was watching it on my phone in Aldous's kitchen when the power cut out. Not a flicker, a severance. The hum of the refrigerator died. The clock on the microwave vanished. The house went so quiet that I could hear the foundation settle. I sat in the dark for 10 minutes, waiting for it to come back. Then I heard the first siren. Not a police siren. The civil defense siren from the water tower on Ridgeworth. The one they tested every first Tuesday and which I'd never heard on a Thursday evening in November. I called my mother. No answer. I called my father. No answer. I called my best friend, Tate Bradshaw, who lived 2 miles east. He picked up on the 6th ring and said, "Colton, my neighbor just broke through our screen door. He's in the kitchen. He's eating our dog. I'm in the bathroom. Colton, he's eating our—" The call dropped. I stood in my dead grandfather's kitchen with my dead grandfather's silence pressing against my ears. Above me, through the ceiling, the attic waited. 2 tons of supplies I'd carried without asking. A dead man's obsession that I'd treated like furniture. I walked to the hallway. I pulled the cord. The ladder unfolded with a groan I'd heard 200 times. I climbed into the dark with my phone flashlight cutting a pale cone through dust that tasted like cardboard and old adhesive. The attic looked different in the dark. Bigger. The shelves Aldous had built ran floor to rafter along both gabled walls, labeled in his handwriting precise block letters with a fine point marker. Water, nutrition, medical, thermal, light, communication, tools, seeds. I stood there, 17 years old, alone, and I said out loud, "What did you know?" The siren answered. Aldous didn't. By midnight, I had dragged down enough to barricade the ground floor. Not strategically, I didn't know what I was doing. I nailed plywood from the garage across the front windows because I'd seen it in hurricane prep footage. I pushed the refrigerator against the back door because it was heavy. I locked every window latch and checked them twice, and then stood in the living room breathing hard with a claw hammer in my hand. Listening. Marsh Creek Road was quiet. That was worse than noise. Our street had 11 houses. The Tillmans had a dog that barked at everything. The Ortegas played music until 10 every night. Mrs. Paulding's motion sensor light triggered whenever a raccoon crossed her yard. Nothing. No barking, no music, no light. Just the siren, which ran for 40 minutes and then cut off mid-tone, as if someone had pulled its plug or been pulled from the switch. I went back to the attic. I needed to understand what I had. Aldous's labeling system was meticulous, but assumed a reader who already knew the plan. Shelf tags referenced a notebook I'd seen him writing in it. A green composition book, but I couldn't find it. I searched for an hour. Under shelves, behind water jugs, in the toolbox. Nothing. He must have kept it with him, which meant it was at the funeral home, or the hospital, or wherever my father had cleared his personal effects without telling me. So I was standing in a supply depot built by a dead architect whose blueprints were missing. I knew the inventory, but not the logic. I knew where the peaches were, but not why. That first night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the hallway with the hammer across my knees and my phone at 4% and no charger that worked without electricity. Every sound was a detonation, a branch scraping the gutter, the house cooling and ticking, a distant car alarm that beeped 11 times and stopped. At dawn, I looked through the gap in the plywood on the east window. Marsh Creek Road looked normal in the gray early light. Frost on lawns, cars and driveways. Then I saw Mrs. Paulding. She was standing in her front yard in a housecoat, facing her own front door, not moving. I watched for 10 minutes. She didn't shift her weight, didn't turn. The frost on her shoulders didn't bother her. Her stillness had a quality I couldn't name, like a machine idling without purpose. Then a car came down the road. Fast. A red hatchback I didn't recognize, swerving slightly, moving at least 60 in a residential 30 zone. Mrs. Paulding turned. Not her head, her whole body, pivoting on her heels like a weather vane. She lunged at the car with a speed that didn't match her 70-year-old frame. She hit the passenger door with her shoulder, dented the panel, and bounced off into the grass. The car never slowed. Mrs. Paulding stood up from the lawn with her left arm bent wrong at the elbow and started walking after it. She didn't cradle the arm. She didn't scream. She walked with the same blank intensity that a compass needle points north. I backed away from the window and sat on the floor and pressed my palms against my eyes until colors bloomed. Then I said it again, louder this time, as if volume would conjure an answer. "What did you know, Grandpa?" By the second day, I'd found the hand crank radio. It was where Aldous said it would be shelf 6 Section C, behind the thermal blankets. I cranked it for 5 minutes and got static across most bands. Then on AM 1240, an automated loop. Shelter in place. Do not approach individuals exhibiting erratic behavior. Emergency services are overwhelmed. Shelter in place. Do not... Looping. No human voice. No update timestamp. No instructions beyond the obvious. I ate a can of chicken soup cold because I was afraid to use the gas stove and produce smell. I didn't know yet whether smell mattered. I didn't know anything. The education Aldous had tried to give me through inventory Saturdays hadn't included the critical lesson, what we were preparing for. He'd never said zombies. He'd never said plague. He'd never said infected. He'd said rotation and redundancy and shelf life. The vocabulary of maintenance, not apocalypse. Tate hadn't called back. My parents hadn't called back. I was alone in a house built like a life raft by a man who drowned before the flood. On the third morning, someone knocked on my door. The knock was wrong. I knew it immediately but couldn't articulate why until the third repetition. It was rhythmic, intentional, patterned. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. Not the random pounding I'd been terrified of, not the mechanical driven forward impact of an infected. This was communication. I went to the east window gap and angled my head until I could see the porch. A man stood there alive, alert, scanning the street while he waited. He was maybe 40, wearing a canvas jacket and work boots, holding a crowbar loosely at his side. Behind him, crouched on the front step, was a girl about my age with a backpack clutched against her chest like a flotation device. I didn't open the door. I spoke through it. "Who are you?" "Name's Graves. Perry Graves. This is my daughter, Sutton. We've been moving since yesterday. Saw your boards. Figured someone alive was inside." His voice was even, controlled, not pleading, not threatening, transactional. "I can't let anyone in." "I understand that. But we've got information. The highway's blocked at Ridgeworth. National Guard set a checkpoint, then abandoned it. There's a mass heading south from Ogden, hundreds, maybe more. They'll hit this street by tonight." I stood behind the door with my hand on the deadbolt. My grandfather's silence filled the hallway. What would Aldous say? The supplies in the attic were calculated for one person. I knew that instinctively the portions, the water gallons, the medical ratios. Aldous had built this for himself. Then after my grandmother died, for himself alone. He hadn't planned for guests. He hadn't planned for community. He'd planned for survival as a solo act, and I'd inherited that arithmetic. But Aldous was also the man who grilled cheese for me every Saturday without fail, who paid me $40 I knew he couldn't afford, who let me into his project not because I was useful, but because I was there. I opened the door. Perry Graves stepped inside with the cautious gratitude of a man who knows the cost of what he's receiving. Sutton followed without speaking, her eyes cataloging the barricades, the hammer on the hallway floor, the fold-down ladder visible at the end of the hall. She was observant in a way that made me feel inventoried. "How long have you been here?" Perry asked, checking the window boards with a professional eye. "It's my grandfather's house. He prepared. There are supplies." Perry turned and looked at me with an expression I'd later learned to recognize. Recalculation. He'd knocked expecting a survivor with canned goods and a shotgun. He'd found a teenager sitting on a cache. I watched him decide, in real time, how to handle that information. "How much supplies?" "A lot." "Enough for 3? "I don't know. Maybe. I haven't counted everything." Sutton spoke for the first time. "We won't take what you can't spare." But my dad's right about the mass coming south. If we're going to be here when they hit, we need to prep now. Not tomorrow. Now. Her voice had the same transactional quality as her father's, but sharpened by something not fear exactly, but velocity. She was already past the emotional stage of this and operating in logistics. The three of us spent the next 6 hours converting Aldous's house from passive shelter into active defense. Perry knew construction. He'd been a site foreman before the outbreak, and he approached barricading with the systematic focus of a man reading blueprints. He reinforced my amateur plywood with proper bracings from the garage lumber. He identified the weakest entry points, the basement windows, the sliding glass door to the back deck, the attic vent that opened to the roof. Sutton worked the interior. She organized the supplies I'd pulled from the attic, creating stations. Water near the upstairs bathroom, medical near the hallway closet, food in the kitchen where prep surfaces existed. She was methodical and silent, and she touched every item with a kind of reverence that confused me until I realized she was reading Aldous's labels, studying them, learning the dead man's system faster than I ever had. By dark, the house felt different, tighter, more intentional, less like a mausoleum and more like a vessel. We ate canned beef stew heated on the gas stove. Perry overruled my smell fear with practical knowledge. They track movement and sound. Smell doesn't carry enough at distance. And sat in the living room with a single candle and the hand-crank radio playing its endless loop. Then Perry said, "I need to tell you what I saw at the checkpoint." Perry sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped, the candlelight making his knuckles look carved from oak. He spoke without looking at me or Sutton, directing his words at the floor as if testifying to a court that wasn't visible. The checkpoint at Ridgeworth was guard. Real guard uniforms, Humvees, barricades. We reached it yesterday around noon. They were processing people, checking for bites, scratches, any open wound. Anyone flagged got pulled to a separate tent. No one came out of that tent. I watched for 2 hours in line. 12 people went in. None came out. Maybe they were being transported somewhere, I said. The tent backed up against a ravine. I heard gunshots, spaced, methodical, one every 2 or 3 minutes. Perry's jaw worked. They weren't transporting anyone. Sutton stared at the candle flame. Her face was unreadable. Then around 2 o'clock, Perry continued, a sergeant came out and announced the checkpoint was closing, relocating south. Everyone still in line should return home and shelter in place. People argued. A woman with a baby was screaming. The guard loaded up in under 10 minutes, professional, rehearsed. They drove south and left 100 civilians standing in the road. By the time we turned back, the first infected had reached the highway from the Ogden direction, moving in a loose column, not organized, just flowing the same direction, like water following a grade. How many? I stopped counting at 200. That was just the leading edge. I did the math without wanting to. Ridgeworth was 9 miles north. Infected moved at walking pace. I'd observed that much from watching Mrs. Paulding. Call it 3 miles per hour on open road, slower on residential streets. They could reach Marsh Creek Road by dawn if nothing diverted them. "We can't be here when they arrive," Perry said. "We can't be outside either." Sutton's voice was flat. "You saw what happens in the open. They converge on movement. Even 3 people walking are a beacon." "Then we have a window," I said, "between now and dawn. To decide. Stay and hide while they pass or run now while the road's clear." Perry looked at me for the first time since starting his account. His expression held something unexpected, deference, not to me, to the house, to the attic, to the dead man's architecture that surrounded us. What would your grandfather have done? I almost laughed. He would have stayed. He built this place to stay. Then we stay, but we go dark. No light, no sound, no movement visible from outside. If the mass passes through without triggering on this house, we survive the night. If they trigger, he left it hanging. We spent the next hour in darkness and discipline. Every candle extinguished, every reflective surface covered or turned. Perry stuffed towels under the doors to block even the suggestion of interior light. Sutton taped black trash bags over the plywood gaps where I'd left viewing slots. We moved in socks on hardwood, communicating in whispers that decayed into hand signals as the night deepened. I lay on the living room floor between midnight and 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling that separated me from Aldous's attic. And I thought about what Perry had said. What would your grandfather have done? The answer I'd given was true. Aldous would have stayed, but incomplete. Aldous would have stayed because Aldous had built the system. He understood it. He knew which supplies served which function, which combinations created which capabilities. I was lying inside his masterpiece like a child inside a piano, surrounded by keys I couldn't play. At 3:17 a.m., I remember the time because the wind-up clock on the mantel was the only sound in the house. I heard the first footsteps outside. Not one set, a texture of movement, like rain beginning on a flat roof. Individual drops becoming indistinguishable from the collective. Shuffling, scraping, the drag of feet that no longer lifted fully between steps. They were here. I pressed my face into the carpet and breathed through my mouth and listened to the mass pass along Marsh Creek Road. And I learned what a herd sounds like when it isn't cattle. It sounds like patience. It sounds like a river that doesn't know it's a river. Individual footfalls merging into a whisper that lasted. I counted 47 minutes. 47 minutes of the dead walking past my grandfather's door. None of them knocked. Dawn came gray and wet, and when I finally dared to check through the crack Sutton had left untaped on the second-floor hallway window, the street was empty. Not clean, there were overturned trash cans, a mailbox torn from its post, dark smears on the Tillman's white garage door that I chose not to examine closely, but empty of moving figures. The relief lasted 8 seconds. Then Perry came upstairs with a look that I'd learned meant new information. Bad category. We've got visitors, backyard, alive. I followed him to the master bedroom, which overlooked the rear deck and the sloped backyard that ran down to the creek. 3 people stood at the tree line. 2 men and a woman. They were looking at the house with the same expression Perry had worn yesterday. Calculation, assessment. One of the men held a hunting rifle. The woman had a baseball bat resting on her shoulder. The third man, shorter, stocky, held nothing but stood slightly forward, which meant he was the one who talked. He proved this by cupping his hands and shouting, "We know you're in there. We watched the herd pass you clean. That means you've got set up. We want to talk." Perry touched my shoulder. "Your call, your house." It wasn't my house. It was Aldous's house. But Aldous was dead, and the dead don't make decisions. So I went downstairs and opened the back door 6 inches, speaking through the gap. "Talk from there." The stocky man smiled not warmly. "Name's Collier. Maddox Collier. These are my people. We were sheltering at the Tillman place. Herd tore through it. We hid in the crawl space, but the house is done. We need a new position. I'm sorry about the Tillman house, but I can't take more people." Collier's smile didn't change. "Son, you've got supplies. We all heard the old man getting deliveries for years. The whole street knew. Now, I don't know how much you've got up there, but I know this. 3 people can't hold a position like this. You need bodies. We need walls. That's a trade. I have enough people. The woman with the bat, tall, angular, her hair pulled back so tight it stretched her forehead, spoke without moving. The herd went south. When it hits whatever's south, it'll scatter. Some will loop back. You need watch rotation. You don't have enough for watch rotation with 3. She was right. I knew she was right. 3 people meant 8-hour shifts with no redundancy, no rest overlap, no capacity for illness or injury. Aldous's single-person plan was already strained at 3. At 6, the supplies divided faster, but the operational capacity multiplied. "What are your names?" I said. Collier pointed. "That's Reeve Dawlish, former Marine." The man with the rifle nodded once. "And Francine Holt. She was ER charge nurse at Ridgeworth General until they closed the doors." A Marine and a nurse. Exactly the skills a survival group scripts into a fantasy. I felt the manipulation, but couldn't identify the mechanism. Was it manipulation to present your qualifications? Or was I being paranoid because my dead grandfather's paranoia was the air I was breathing? I let them in. Within an hour, the house's dynamics restructured. Reeve took over security assessment with the authority of someone who'd been waiting for permission to act. His audit was blunt. Window boards are amateur. The back deck is a liability. The attic is the strong point, but if they breach ground floor, there's only one ladder up. That's a coffin, not a fallback. He suggested solutions. I nodded. Perry watched Reeve with the specific attention of a man measuring whether he'd just been replaced. Francine inventoried the medical supplies with the efficiency of someone reading a familiar language. She found items I hadn't recognized. The veterinary antibiotics were amoxicillin in different packaging. The unlabeled bottles on shelf 4 were electrolyte concentrate. The small locked case I'd never opened, she identified it by shape as a suture kit. Collier did nothing. He walked through the house, touching walls, opening cabinets, standing in each room as if measuring it with his body. He asked me questions. How old was your grandfather when he started this? Did he have military background? Did he ever mention who told him to prepare? No one told him, I said. He was just careful. Collier smiled that non-warm smile again. No one's this careful without a reason, son. No one spends a decade filling an attic without knowing something. He had dementia, I said. It was the first time I'd spoken it aloud. The word felt like a stone dropped into water. It changed the surface of everything. He was diagnosed 6 years ago. The stockpiling started before that, but it got compulsive. After. Collier's smile faded. He looked at the ceiling at the attic above us, and I watched something recalculate behind his eyes. So this isn't a plan. This is a symptom. It's both, I said. By the second night, Maddox Collier had started using the word we in a way that excluded me. We should ration the water to 1 gallon per person per day. We need to establish scouting routes to the east. We should inventory the ammunition situation. There was no ammunition. Aldous hadn't stockpiled weapons. That gap had confused me until Francine pointed out that a man managing cognitive decline might have deliberately excluded items that could harm him during a confused episode. But Collier kept saying we, and kept making declarations that Perry would look to me to confirm or deny. Each confirmation I gave transferred a thin layer of authority toward Collier. Each denial risked confrontation with a man whose 2 allies included someone holding a rifle. On the 3rd night, Sutton found me in the attic. I was sitting between shelf rows with the wind-up flashlight, reading Aldous's labels again, looking for the notebook that didn't exist. "You're losing the house," she said. "It's not a competition." "It is. Collier's treating your grandfather's supplies like communal property because he showed up. That's not sharing, that's appropriation by presence. What am I supposed to do? Tell a Marine and a nurse they can't eat? You're supposed to understand what Collier's doing. He's building a structure. In 2 more days, he'll be making decisions without asking you. And everyone will accept it because he sounds like he knows what he's doing. Maybe he does know what he's doing." Sutton sat down across from me. In the flashlight's upward spill, her face was all angles and shadow. "My dad knows what he's doing too. The difference is he respects whose house we're in. Collier doesn't. Collier sees a 17-year-old sitting on a pile and thinks, that's not ownership, that's an accident." She was right. I'd felt it but hadn't named it. Collier wasn't hostile. He was administrative. He was reorganizing ownership through procedure, through we. And by the time I objected, the consensus would already be his. What do I do? Control the attic. It's the only leverage you have. Everything in this house flows from up here. If you control distribution, you control the house. If Collier controls distribution, you're a guest in your own inheritance. I spent the next morning implementing this. I told the group that I'd continue managing supply distribution on a schedule I'd maintain privately. Perry nodded. He'd expected this. Reeve shrugged. He cared about security, not logistics. Francine accepted without expression. Collier's jaw tightened by 1 degree, and he said, "That's a lot of responsibility for one person. What if something happens to you?" Then Sutton takes over. She knows the system. She's been here 2 days. She's been studying it for 2 days. That's 2 days more than you. Collier looked at me with a new expression. Reappraisal. He'd classified me as passive the inheritor, not the architect. Now he was adjusting. I could see the pivot happening, from administrative takeover to longer strategy. He wouldn't push today. He'd build consensus. He'd make himself indispensable through competence, and then wait for me to make an error that justified intervention. I had maybe a week before his patience outweighed his caution. That afternoon, Reeve returned from a scouting trip to the north end of Marsh Creek with news. A group of survivors, 8 or 9, had fortified the Ember Lane church 3 blocks up. They'd hung a bedsheet from the steeple with spray-painted letters. "Alive, armed, trading." "Trading what?" Perry asked. "Don't know. Didn't approach. But they've got the church stone walls, small windows, elevated position. Better defensive structure than this." Collier absorbed this immediately. "We should make contact, pool resources, coordinate defense zones." "We don't know who they are," I said. "We didn't know who we were either 3 days ago. Community is how you survive this." Community. The word sounded different in Collier's mouth than it would have in Aldous's. Aldous built for one. Collier built for control. Community for him was a structure, and every structure has a head. I said nothing. But I noticed Francine glancing at the attic hatch, and I noticed Reeve watching me notice. And I understood that the house was becoming a system that I was no longer the only one trying to read. I went to the church on the 5th day, not because Collier insisted, though he did, twice, but because the radio loop changed. The automated message cut off midday on day 4 and replaced with a new voice, a tired human voice that said, "This is Regional Coordinator Weston with FEMA Provisional Authority. The Ogden containment has failed. All civilians north of Highway 40 are advised to move south to intake centers at Dunmore and Cedar Flat. Military escort is not available. Travel at your own risk. God help you. Then static. Then the loop restarted with the old message, as if the system hadn't registered the update. South. The herd had gone south. The intake centers were south. The military had gone south. Everything institutional was south. And south was where the dead were walking. I went to the church because I needed to know if anyone else had heard that broadcast and understood the contradiction it contained. Sutton came with me. Perry wanted to, but Reeve argued that the house needed at least 3 defenders: Perry, Francine, and himself, in case the church visit was a trap. Collier volunteered to join me instead. I declined without explaining and watched his jaw do that 1-degree tightening again. The walk to Ember Lane Church was 3 blocks through residential streets that looked like a stage set struck by a careless crew. Doors open. Cars parked at odd angles where they'd been abandoned mid-maneuver. A bicycle on its side in the middle of Crescent Avenue with the front wheel still slowly spinning in the wind. Impossible, that. It must have been caught by a gust as we watched, and everywhere. That absence of sound that was becoming the new baseline. No birds, no engines, no distant bass from a neighbor's stereo. Just wind and the creak of unsecured things. We saw 2 infected on the walk, both distant, one standing motionless in a backyard 3 houses down, facing a fence. Another walking a slow elliptical pattern in the parking lot of the dry cleaners on Birch Street, circling an overturned shopping cart as if it had forgotten what drew it there. Neither reacted to us. We moved carefully, kept to yard cover, and they remained fixed in their private loops. The church announced itself by the sheet on the steeple, now rain-dampened and drooping, the spray paint letters bleeding into pink rivulets. Alive, armed, trading. A man stood on the church roof with a scoped rifle, tracking us for the last block. He didn't shout or wave. He watched. At the front steps, a woman met us. She was perhaps 50, weathered, wearing a men's flannel shirt rolled to the elbows and holding a clipboard, in the apocalypse with actual paper attached. Names and origin point, she said. Colton Embry, Sutton Graves. We're from Marsh Creek Road. The supply house. She said it without inflection, but the recognition was immediate. We've heard about it. Old man Embry's place. He was my grandfather. She studied me. I'm Petra Quinlan. I coordinate intake here. Pastor's inside. He'll want to meet you. We've got 31 people. 12 were original congregation. The rest came in over 4 days. We're doing okay on water. The church has a well, but food's tight and medical's tighter. 31 people. In a stone church with small windows and a well. They were better positioned defensively than we were. Worse on supplies. The trade implication was obvious before she said it. You've got surplus food and medical, Petra said. We've got defensive position and manpower. We should talk. She led us inside. The nave was transformed pews pushed to the walls, sleeping mats covering the floor in organized rows, a cooking station near the back exit using the church kitchen's gas line. People looked up as we entered. Children. I counted 4 children under 10. Their presence hit differently than the adults. They were evidence of families, of futures, of stakes beyond individual survival. The pastor was a man named Harland Wesser. No relation to the FEMA coordinator on the radio, unless coincidence was unkind. He was young for a pastor, maybe 35, with a calm intensity that suggested either deep faith or deep compartmentalization. He shook my hand with both of his and said, "Your grandfather was a member of this congregation for 30 years. Did you know that?" I didn't. Aldous never mentioned church. Never mentioned faith at all. No. He stopped attending about 6 years ago. We assumed health. Now, Harlan gestured at the stocked nave, at the survivors in his care. Now I wonder if he was attending to something else. Harlan wanted an alliance. He framed it in community language: mutual aid, shared responsibility, combined strength, but the underlying structure was identical to what Collier was building inside my house. Access to Aldous' supplies in exchange for social legitimacy. The difference was scale. Collier wanted to control distribution for 6 people. Harlan wanted to feed 31. We can't supply 31 people, I told him. The attic was built for 1 person over 1 year, maybe 2 at ration levels. We're already at 6. I'm not asking you to feed everyone, Harlan said. I'm asking for medical supplies. Specifically, we have 3 people with injuries from the first night, and one of them, a 12-year-old, has an infected wound that's going septic. Francine Holt would know what to do with the antibiotics you have. Can we borrow her? Can we borrow amoxicillin? A 12-year-old. Sepsis. Antibiotics sitting in my attic that I couldn't even correctly dose. The moral geometry was so obvious it felt constructed as if the universe was testing whether I'd become the door I was afraid of. I'll bring antibiotics back today, I said. And I'll ask Francine if she's willing to come treat the wound. Thank you. Harlan's gratitude was genuine, but contained. He was already past this transaction and on to the next. There's something else. The broadcast. Did you hear the FEMA update? South isn't safe. South isn't safe. And they're telling people to go there. Which means one of 2 things. They don't know the herd went south, or they know and they're funneling people anyway. For intake processing that might include the same policy that Checkpoint was running. He meant the tent no one came out of. The gunshots. You think they're eliminating people at intake? I think institutions under crisis pressure don't distinguish between infected and potentially infected. I think anyone arriving at those centers without verification of non-exposure will be treated as a risk. And treating risks in a military context? He let me finish the sentence myself. Sutton hadn't spoken since entering the church. Now she said, if South is closed, what's the alternative? Stay, fortify, outlast. Harlan folded his hands on the table between us, a gesture that was pastoral instinct, the pose of counseling. The dead don't eat each other. They don't drink. They don't heal. Biology dictates a limit. Decomposition is real. Muscle atrophy without nutrition is real. Whatever this is, infection, pathogen, prion, the animated bodies are still subject to physical law. In weeks, maybe months, they'll deteriorate to the point of immobility. We don't have to win. We have to wait. It was the most optimistic framework I'd heard since the sirens, and it depended entirely on one assumption: that we could survive weeks or months in a fixed position against an unpredictable threat with finite supplies and growing community needs. I took the antibiotics home. Francine went back with Sutton the next morning. When they returned that evening, Francine reported that the boy's wound was responding to treatment, and that the church's medical needs extended far beyond one infection. They had untreated lacerations, dehydration, a woman in early pregnancy with no prenatal care, and an elderly man whose heart medication had run out. Collier listened to this report with visible satisfaction. So, we're the supply line. That makes us essential. Essential means protected. This is good. This isn't good, I said. This is 31 people who need more than we have. Then we trade what we can for what we need. Position, manpower, information. That's how economies work. People aren't economics. Collier gave me that reappraising look again. Everything is economics, Colton. Your grandfather understood that. Every shelf in that attic is a calculated exchange of money now for survival later. He was the most economic thinker on this street. I wanted to argue. But the truth was complicated. Aldous had made those calculations. Every Saturday purchase was a trade present dollars for future breath. What I couldn't tell Collier was that the calculation had been driven not by strategy, but by fear. Not the rational fear of a prepper who reads scenarios and builds responses, but the irrational fear of a man who felt his mind dissolving and responded by filling physical space with physical proof that he'd existed, that he'd acted, that he'd tried. The attic wasn't a plan. It was a prayer in the shape of canned goods. But Collier didn't need to know that. The attic's origin didn't diminish its utility. A prayer can still feed you. On day 8, 2 things happened that broke the equilibrium I'd been maintaining through careful distribution and careful silence. First, Reeve found the notebook. Not Aldous's green composition book that was still missing, maybe gone forever, but a different one. A small leather-bound journal wedged between the joists above the attic. Invisible unless you were lying flat on your back, looking up at the rafters, which Reeve was doing while reinforcing the roof access point. He pried it loose and brought it to me without opening it, which I respected. The journal was older than the stockpiling. The first entry was dated 11 years back. The handwriting was Aldous's, but looser, less controlled than the shelf labels these were written before the diagnosis, when his hand still trusted itself. I read the first page in the attic alone, flashlight balanced on a water jug. Dr. Phelan confirmed today, early onset Alzheimer's, probably 5 to 8 years before significant decline. I have 5 years to prepare for a version of myself that won't remember why. The house will remember for me. The shelves will be my external memory. If I lose my mind, the supplies will keep my body alive until someone finds me or until it doesn't matter. I'm not preparing for the end of the world. I'm preparing for the end of me. I sat in the attic and cried for the first time since the outbreak. Not for the dead walking outside. For my grandfather, who'd spent a decade building a monument to his own erasure, and who died in the hallway trying to tell me about peaches because his mind had already reduced the entire system to its smallest component. He wasn't a prophet. He wasn't a conspiracist. He was a man trying to outrun his own disappearance. The second thing that happened on day 8, a group from the church arrived at our door. Not Harland, not Petra. 5 men I hadn't met, led by a tall figure who introduced himself as Brennan Yost. They weren't asking for medical supplies. "We need the attic inventory," Brennan said. "Complete list, quantities, locations, expiration dates. Harlan's building a community resource map, and your cache is the largest single asset in the zone." "The inventory is managed here," I said, "by a teenager, with no oversight, while 31 people 3 blocks away are rationing to 1 meal a day." Brennan's tone wasn't aggressive. It was righteous. He believed what he was saying. "We're not taking anything from you, kid. We're asking for transparency." Behind me, I felt Collier step closer. He said, "That seems reasonable." I turned. Collier was nodding slightly, his expression open, his stance relaxed. The performance of conciliation. And I understood, in that moment, what was happening. Collier had been communicating with the church, building a consensus outside the house that the supplies should be communally managed. Brennan's appearance wasn't spontaneous. It was Collier's move, executed through external pressure. "No," I said. To Brennan, to Collier, to the entire structure they'd built around me without my consent. The inventory stays private. Distribution stays with me. If the church needs something specific, they ask and I decide. That's the arrangement Harland and I made. Harland isn't in charge of everyone's patience, Brennan said. And you're not in charge of my grandfather's attic. The silence that followed had weight. Brennan stared at me. Collier stayed still. Perry, who'd appeared in the hallway behind me, put his hand on the wall, a casual gesture that happened to position him between Collier and the attic hatch. Brennan left. But he left the way a tide leaves, with the certainty of return. That night, Collier cornered me in the kitchen. You're making enemies we don't need. You're making alliances I didn't authorize. He didn't deny it. I'm trying to keep us alive. You're thinking like this is yours. It's not. It stopped being yours the moment the world ended. Everything belongs to whoever survives. My grandfather built this. Your grandfather was confused. You said so yourself. He was hoarding because his brain was broken. Now that hoard is the only thing between 40 people and starvation, and you're treating it like a sentimental inheritance. I wanted to hit him. The violence of the impulse shocked me. I'd never hit anyone. But Collier had said the thing I was most afraid of, that Aldous's love and Aldous's illness were the same thing, and that both were irrelevant now. The morning after Brennan's visit, I climbed into the attic before dawn and did something I should have done on day one. I counted everything. Not estimated, not scanned, not roughly cataloged. Counted, item by item, shelf by shelf. I used a pencil stub and the back pages of Aldous's leather journal, and I wrote down every can, every bottle, every packet, every roll of tape, and every gallon of water. The numbers told a story I hadn't wanted to hear. At current population, 6 people in the house and current ration levels, the food supplies would last approximately 42 days. The water was better 80 days if we supplemented with rain collection, which Aldous had apparently planned for because I found a folded tarp with grommets and a collection barrel on the lowest shelf. Medical supplies were wildly variable. Antibiotics for maybe 2 courses of treatment, bandages for months. But no painkillers stronger than ibuprofen, and no surgical capacity beyond suturing. 42 days of food for 6, 21 days for 12, 11 days for 24, 5 days for 48. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. The more people Collier's Community Vision incorporated, the faster the attic emptied. Aldous had built for one person for 1 year. Every additional body was a division. But Harlan's argument, wait, outlast, let decomposition solve the problem, required time. Weeks minimum. Months probably. 42 days might be enough. 21 would not. I was caught between 2 truths that couldn't coexist. Share broadly and run out before the crisis ends. Hoard tightly and watch people 3 blocks away starve while sitting on canned peaches. Aldous's journal entry returned to me. I'm not preparing for the end of the world. I'm preparing for the end of me. He'd built this for self-preservation in its most literal form, keeping a body alive when the mind piloting it could no longer be trusted. The supplies weren't a gift to the community. They were a man's desperate attempt to survive himself. But Aldous was dead, and I was alive. And the supplies were the same supplies, regardless of why they existed. Collier was right about one thing. The origin doesn't change the utility. A prayer can still feed you. I came down from the attic with the numbers in my head and found Perry waiting at the base of the ladder. How bad? He asked. 6 weeks at 6 people, less if we keep giving to the church. Perry absorbed this without visible reaction. What are you going to do? I don't know yet. Collier's going to push for full integration with the church. He's already talking to Reeve about it. If we merge with the church group, they have better defenses and we have food. Combined, we might stretch longer through rationing. Or we run out faster because 37 mouths eat faster than 6. True, but 37 people can also forage, scavenge, and grow. 6 can't. Your grandfather stored seed packets. Long-term survival isn't about the attic, it's about what comes after the attic. Perry wasn't advocating. He was presenting. The difference was why I trusted him more than anyone else in that house. He gave me information and let me make the decision without positioning himself to benefit from either outcome. What does Sutton think? I asked. She thinks you should burn the notebook. What? Aldous's journal, the one where he explains why he built this. She thinks if Collier or the church people read it, learned this was a dementia response, not a strategic plan, they'll lose whatever respect for the system is keeping them from just taking it. I hadn't considered that. The journal was truth. But truth in this context was a weapon that could be pointed at me. If the community learned that their primary resource cache was assembled by a man with a deteriorating mind, the cache's credibility and, by extension, my authority over it would evaporate. Collier would argue that a confused man's random purchases needed expert reorganization. Brennan would argue that no one person should steward an irrational collection. The truth about Aldous would become the justification for taking everything from me. Sutton was right. The truth was dangerous. But burning it meant erasing the only document that proved my grandfather's love. The only evidence that behind the obsessive purchasing was a man terrified of losing himself, building a physical structure to hold the identity his brain was dissolving. I didn't burn it. I hid it deeper. Day 11. The knock came at 4 in the morning, not the 3 and 3 pattern Perry had used. This was frantic, unrhythmic, human. I reached the door with a claw hammer before anyone else woke. Through the gap in the plywood, Petra Quinlan, the clipboard woman from the church, bleeding from a gash above her left eye, alone in the pre-dawn dark. They turned on Harland, she said before I could ask. Brennan, half the congregation. They voted him out at midnight. Voted for redistribution of all community assets, which means yours. They're coming at first light. I pulled her inside. Perry appeared on the stairs, dressed, alert he'd been sleeping lightly since day 1. Within minutes, everyone was awake and in the living room. And Petra told us what had happened. Brennan Yost had organized quietly for 3 days after my refusal. His argument was simple and persuasive. A 17-year-old was hoarding supplies assembled by a mentally ill man, while children in the church went hungry. He'd gathered 15 adults into a voting block. When Harlan tried to maintain the existing arrangement Colton distributes, we receive what he shares Brennan called for a leadership vote. Harlan lost 19-12. Brennan was now in charge of the church group, and his first declared action was securing the Embry supply cache for equitable community distribution. Securing, Perry repeated. That's a military word. Brennan was National Guard, Petra said. Reserve. He's got training and he's got Reeve Dawlish's training too, which is... She stopped, looked at me. Reeve's gone. He left 3 hours ago. I think he went to the church. I looked at the hallway where Reeve had been sleeping. His mat was empty. His rifle was gone. Perry said what I was thinking. Collier? We checked. Collier was in the upstairs bedroom, apparently asleep. but apparently was doing a lot of work in that sentence. His boots were on. His jacket was draped over the chair within arm's reach. I went back downstairs. Francine was wrapping Petra's head wound with supplies from the hallway medical station. Sutton stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, face neutral but eyes active. "How long until first light?" I asked. 90 minutes. "How many armed people does Brennan have?" Petra shook her head. "Reeves' rifle. 2 shotguns from the Millard house they scavenged day 3. A few handguns. Maybe 8 people willing to use them. 8 armed people coming for the house, against 4 me, Perry, Sutton, Francine with no firearms. 1 claw hammer, 1 crowbar, the plywood barricades that Reeve himself had designed, whose weaknesses he knew because he'd mapped them. "We can't hold this house against armed people," Perry said, quietly, factually. "Then we don't hold it." Sutton's voice was calm. "We moved the supplies." Everyone looked at her. She continued, "They're coming for the attic, for the shelves, for the cache in this specific location. If the supplies aren't here when they arrive, there's nothing to take. The house without the attic is just a house." "Moved 2 tons of supplies in 90 minutes? Francine looked skeptical. "Where?" "Not all of it. Critical items, medicine, seeds, water purification, the irreplaceables. Let them have the canned goods. Let them have the blankets. Those are replaceable through scavenging. The things that can't be found anywhere else, that's what we save." It was triage, not of people, of objects. And it required accepting a loss I wasn't sure I could stomach, letting strangers walk into Aldous's attic and take what his hands had placed. But Aldous's hands were dust, and my hands were alive. And alive has to mean something other than holding on. "Where do we take it?" I asked. "Creek." Perry was already moving toward the back door. "Aldous's property runs to the water. There's a culvert under the bridge at Marsh Creek Road, concrete, dry inside, not visible from street level. We stage there. If the house falls, we retreat south along the creek bed. Invisible, below sightline. 87 minutes. We worked in the dark with flashlights taped to point downward, making trip after trip through the backyard to the creek bank. Sutton and I carried water purification tablets, seed packets, the suture kit, the full medical shelf, the hand crank radio, 6 emergency blankets, the tarp and collection barrel. Perry carried the heavier items, water jugs, the toolbox, the locked case of specialized supplies. Francine carried what she could with one arm, while the other held a flashlight on the uneven ground. We left the bulk. The canned food, the blankets, the flashlights and batteries. Everything that looked like a supply cache we left in place. What we took was the spine, the future, the things that enabled continuation rather than just consumption. Collier emerged from upstairs at the 40-minute mark, boots already on, jacket already in hand. He looked at the half-empty attic shelves and said nothing for 10 seconds. Then, "So you chose to run?" "I chose to survive," I said. "Same thing. Running is what prey does. And fighting 8 guns with a hammer is what dead people do. You're welcome to stay." He looked at me with that expression, one final time recalculation, and then he smiled. Not the cold smile, a different one, almost admiring. "You're more like the old man than I thought." He stayed. We were in the culvert when dawn broke and the church group came for the house. We couldn't see them. The culvert was 200 yards south, tucked under the bridge, but we heard the commotion. Voices. A door being forced. Then, after a long silence, a single gunshot that might have been a signal, or might have been something else entirely. 5 people in a concrete tube with the creek trickling past. Me, Perry, Sutton, Francine, Petra. The critical supplies stacked behind us in the dry section. The morning cold pressing through our clothes. "Now what?" Francine asked. The question exposed the gap in my plan. I'd saved the spine but lost the skeleton. The house was gone. The structure was gone. Oh, the walls and roof and barricades were gone. We were outside, exposed. In a world where being outside meant being visible. And being visible meant being found not just by Brennan's militia, but by the dead. "South along the creek," Perry said. 3 miles downstream there's a water treatment facility. Industrial building. Concrete, fenced. It won't be occupied. No residential value. No obvious supply draw. "You know this area?" "I built the parking lot extension 2 years ago. Foreman, remember? I know the building's layout, access points, sight lines." He paused. "And there's a maintenance tunnel that runs from the facility to the pumping station upstream. Underground passage, 200 yards. If we get pressed, we have an escape route that nobody else knows about." I looked at Sutton. She was studying her father with an expression I recognized. She'd heard this before. He'd already planned this fallback. The house on Marsh Creek was never his endpoint. It was his staging area. Perry Graves had been engineering his own exit strategy since day one, quietly, without declaring it, because declaring plans makes them communal property. We moved at mid-morning, staying in the creek bed below the sight line of the road. The water was ankle-deep and cold enough to numb within minutes, but it masked sound and kept us invisible from anything on the street above. Twice we heard movement on the bridge overpass, shuffling footsteps, not human rhythm, and pressed flat against the concrete embankment until the sound faded. 3 miles took 4 hours. Creek beds aren't paths, they're obstacle courses of rock, root, fallen branch, and mud that sucks at your boots with every step. Francine struggled with the uneven ground, and Petra's head wound started bleeding again from the exertion. But we moved, and we stayed hidden. And by early afternoon, the water treatment facility rose on the east bank. A gray concrete block surrounded by chain link. Exactly as industrial and exactly as unappealing as Perry had described. The fence had a maintenance gate on the creek side, padlocked. Perry produced a bolt cutter from the toolbox. Aldous's toolbox, I realized, with Aldous's tools. The old man's provision extended even here, into a scenario he'd never imagined, solving a problem he'd never anticipated. Inside the fence, the facility was deserted. The building itself was a single large processing hall with an attached office wing. No windows on the ground floor, just ventilation slits high on the walls. One main entrance, one loading dock, and the maintenance tunnel access in the basement. Perry walked us through it with the confidence of someone returning to a job site. Control room here, storage here. The main tank hall is useless to us, too open, but the office wing has individual rooms, heavy doors, interior access only. By evening, we'd established the office wing as living quarters, distributed the supplies we'd saved into a system that Sutton designed and I approved, and set a watch rotation that all 5 of us could maintain. The facility had no electricity, no running water. The pumps were dead without grid power, but it had walls, concealment, and the tunnel. And it had something else. Distance. From the church, from Collier, from Brennan, from the community that had formed around my grandfather's supplies and then consumed the community that formed around my grandfather's grandson. I sat in the control room that first night, the leather journal open on my knees, reading Aldous's entries by flashlight. He wrote about his diagnosis, about his fear, about the strange comfort of purchasing survival items, each one a small promise that the future would contain his body, even after his mind fled. He wrote about me. Colton helped again today. He doesn't understand why we're doing this. He'll understand later, or he won't. And either way, the supplies will be there. The supplies don't require understanding. They require presence. He was wrong about one thing. They did require understanding, not of the system of the love behind it. Without understanding, the supplies were just objects. With understanding, they were a man's final act of care for a future self that never arrived, and for a grandson who inherited the care without the context. 3 weeks in the treatment facility, 3 weeks of ration supplies and rainwater collection and the slow education of survival without walls that someone else was trying to breach. Petra healed. Francine established medical protocols using the supplies we'd saved. Perry maintained the building with the steady competence of a man whose purpose and skill had finally aligned. Sutton and I managed distribution, a system we'd refined into something that would have made Aldous proud if Aldous could have understood pride by the end. We weren't thriving. We were persisting. And persistence, I was learning, has its own kind of dignity. On day 31, Petra returned from a scouting run to the north with information. The church group had fractured. Brennan's leadership lasted 12 days before the supplies he'd seized, the canned goods, the blankets, the bulk items we'd left behind, ran out. Without the medical supplies, without the water purification, without the seeds, the cash was consumption without continuation. They ate everything and had nothing to grow into. Some left south, toward the FEMA centers that may or may not have been execution points. Some scattered into houses along the street. Brennan and a core group of 6 still held the church, but they were scavenging now, venturing further each day into territory they hadn't mapped, taking risks that the dead punished with perfect indifference. Collier, Petra said, had stayed in my grandfather's house alone. He'd become a kind of hermit. The house without its supplies was just a building. And a building without a community was just shelter. And shelter without purpose was just waiting. He hadn't come south, hadn't sought us out. He existed in the house like a hermit crab in a shell that no longer fit. I thought about going back, not to the house, to Collier, to tell him what I'd learned from the journal. That the attic was a love letter written in the wrong alphabet. That Aldous wasn't a prophet or a prepper or a hoarder. He was a father and grandfather who knew he was disappearing and tried to leave his body's needs met, even after his mind abandoned the project. I thought Collier deserved to know that the thing he'd tried to control was built by someone who'd already lost all control and was terrified of that loss. But I didn't go, because the truth about Aldous was mine. It was the last private thing I had from him. And sharing it wouldn't change Collier's situation. It would only change how Collier thought about me. And I was done being thought about by people who saw me as an obstacle between themselves and supplies. On day 34, the first visible signs of Harlan's theory appeared. Sutton spotted it first, an infected on the road near the facility, moving slowly, listing to one side. Its left leg dragged uselessly, not from injury, but from degradation. The muscle had wasted. The connective tissue was failing. It moved in a tight circle, unable to maintain a straight path, like a wind-up toy with one gear stripped. Over the next week, we saw more. The dead were decaying, not metaphorically, literally. The biological truth was asserting itself. Bodies without nutrition, without repair mechanisms, without rest, were burning through their own tissue. The ones that had been turned early in the first days of the outbreak were furthest gone. Bones visible through stretched skin, joints that wouldn't articulate, jaws that hung open because the muscles that closed them had dissolved. Harland was right. Time was the weapon. Not bullets, not barricades, not hoarded supplies. Time. The dead were consuming themselves, and every day we survived was a day closer to their mechanical failure. I sat with this knowledge in the control room and felt something I hadn't felt since before the outbreak. Horizon. Not the immediate horizon of tomorrow's ration and tonight's watch shift. A longer one. Weeks, months. A future that extended beyond survival arithmetic into something that might resemble living. The seeds. Aldous's seed packets, 12 varieties of vegetable, carefully vacuum sealed and labeled with planting zones and seasons. I'd carried them from the attic to the culvert to the creek to the facility without fully registering their significance. They weren't food. They were the promise of food. They were the future tense. Aldous, in his diminishing mind, had stored not just the present, but the continuity. We planted the first garden in the facility's south lot on day 38. Turned the soil with tools from Aldous's toolbox. Used the water collection system we'd built from his tarp and barrel. Sutton and I worked side by side in the spring earth because it was spring now, impossibly. The calendar having advanced without permission and planted seeds that a dying man had stored for a future he could neither imagine nor remember. Day 44. I was in the garden when Perry called from the roof. His voice carried the specific pitch of information, without alarm, something to see, not something to fear. I climbed the exterior ladder to the flat roof where Perry kept the observation position. He pointed north. On the road, a figure was walking toward the facility. Slowly, not with the mechanical pace of the infected, with the weary, deliberate pace of someone who'd been walking a long time and knew they had further to go. As the figure came closer, details resolved. Young, male, wearing a backpack with a sleeping bag strapped to the top. He was looking at our building with obvious intention. When he reached the fence line, he stopped and raised both hands empty. I went down, opened the gate. Up close, he was maybe my age, thin, sunburned, with the exhausted eyes of someone who hadn't slept indoors in weeks. He said, "I'm Winslow. Winslow Carey. I came from the south. The intake centers are closed. There's nothing south. Closed or just closed, empty. Nobody home. Whatever FEMA was running, they packed up and left. The south is just dead people walking slower and slower and buildings with nobody in them." I brought him inside, fed him from our carefully rationed stores. He ate with the desperate restraint of someone who wants to devour everything, but has learned that eating too fast after starvation invites agony. Winslow told us about the South. The herd we'd heard pass on that first night had continued for over 50 miles before dispersing. The FEMA centers had operated for 9 days before military withdrawal. In those 9 days, they'd processed thousands, but processed meant screened. And screened meant separated. And separated meant some people went into the safe zone and some people didn't. Winslow didn't know what happened to the ones who didn't. He'd been in a car with his mother when they were separated at the gate. He made it inside. She didn't. He waited 3 days. On the 4th day, the military pulled out. Everyone inside was left with nothing. He'd been walking north since. His mother's name was Darla. He told me this without prompting, quietly, while looking at the wall, just her name, offering it into the air like a coin into a fountain. "You can stay," I said. Not because I had the authority to say it. The group decided these things collectively now, by consensus, the way we'd evolved past the need for single-point control. But because I wanted him to hear it immediately, to not have to wait, to not have to stand at a door and wonder if it would open. The group agreed. 6 became 6, then 7. Over the following weeks, others came. Not many, 2 more, then 3, drawn by the sight of the garden, by the tended fence, by the evidence of habitation that wasn't fortification. We were growing something that looked from the road, not like a bunker, but like a home. Not like hoarded supplies behind locked doors, but like food growing in open soil. By day 52, the garden was producing its first greens. By day 60, the infected we saw were barely mobile, crawling, dragging, collapsing into stillness that might be final. By day 70, we started hearing birds again. Just sparrows at first, returning to territory they'd abandoned. But birds meant insects. Insects meant ecosystem recovery. The world was reasserting its cycles. And in the control room, on the shelf where I kept the things that mattered, Aldous's journal sat next to the seed packets, empty now, their contents in the ground, becoming food, becoming future. The wrong reason for the right outcome. The confused love that kept me alive. Collier had said, "Everything is economics." Harland had said, "We just have to wait." Perry had said, "Long-term survival isn't about the attic, it's about what comes after." Aldous hadn't said anything. Aldous had just filled shelves, Saturday after Saturday, with hands that were forgetting why they moved, but moving anyway. I was 19 years old. I was alive. The attic was empty and 3 miles behind me. And the seeds, my inheritance, my grandfather's last coherent gift, were flowering in soil I'd turned with his tools. There's a version of this story where my grandfather was a genius, where he saw the outbreak coming, where every can and every packet was a calculated move, in a chess game against fate. People want that version. Winslow asked me once if Aldous had been military. Petra suggested intelligence community. Everyone wanted the attic to mean foresight, to mean that someone, somewhere, had known. Nobody knew. A frightened old man felt his mind dissolving and filled his house with objects, because objects don't forget. Because a shelf of water jugs is certainty when your own name becomes uncertain. Because placing a can into a row and labeling it with block letters is proof of agency when agency is the thing being stolen. He built for one. He built for himself, for the future body that would house a departed mind. He built wrong. He built for the wrong crisis, the wrong scale, the wrong duration. And every single thing he did kept me alive. I can't repay him. He forgot me before he died the last months. I was the boy who helps. And then the boy. And then just a shape that handed him boxes. I can't explain what his work meant because meaning requires a mind to receive it. And his is gone. The debt exists in one direction only, forward. From me into whatever comes next, carrying his tools, eating from his seeds, living in the architecture of love that wore the wrong name for 20 years. The attic is empty. The garden is full. His hands built both.